Greetings to all the viewers from across the world. Welcome to this international seminar on recent coup in Myanmar, what next and what are its implications, organized by Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global organization working in the areas of international relations, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. I am Soham Das, Director, Tillotoma Foundation. All the panelists of today's seminar are eminent experts on Myanmar and Southeast Asia. The distinguished experts at this international seminar are Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, former Indian Ambassador to Myanmar, former Director General, Indian Council for World Affairs, and Distinguished Fellow, Gateway House. Dr. Sreeradha Dr, Center Head and Senior Fellow, Neighbourhood Studies, Vivekananda International Foundation. Dr. Udai Bhanu Singh, Senior Research Associate and Coordinator, Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Mr. Subir Bhaumik, author and former correspondent, BBC. The discussion will be chaired and moderated by Professor Baladas Ghoshal, Distinguished Advisor, Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian Studies, Tillotoma Foundation. Professor Ghoshal is one of the most experienced experts on Southeast Asia. We shall be discussing the volatile situation in Myanmar since the military coup has taken place. Feel free to send in questions and comments for the panelists. Let me now invite Professor Ghoshal to make his remarks and take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much. Now, very warm welcome to you, all of you, those who are panelists, as well as those who have joined this webinar as a participant. I'll begin with a rider that all my statements that I'll be making has nothing to do with my own ideological preferences. I'll be making certain propositions on the basis of my training as a political scientist, and will not be guided by what I believe as an ideology. Having said that, I think what I'll do, I'll make a couple of propositions and then try to support it. The first proposition that I'll make is that the developments in Myanmar, the coup and the subsequent developments, are essentially a function of internal political dynamics. Since it is a function of internal political dynamics, I come to the second proposition. Outsiders or other countries or powers will not be able to make much dent into the political developments there, nor will they be able to influence the way things will shape up within the country. The third proposition, of course related to the first proposition, is that the only country or only organization, not the country, but the organization that can make some changes in the situation is the ASEAN. Now, ASEAN has certain stakes in the kind of developments that are taking place in Myanmar. For one, the way things have shaped up in the last 1 month, violence, mass demonstrations, and countrywide protest against the military regime will definitely have certain impact on the domestic, not only on the domestic political development, but also on the region. ASEAN wants to retain peace and stability in Southeast Asia, particularly more important after the pandemic, when things have gone all sort of haywire. Peace and stability is very important for ASEAN countries to pursue their future goals of development, and also to try to deal with the pandemic situation. Now, since they are involved or they are interested in peace and stability of the country, they obviously have a stake in Myanmar. And the only kind of sensitivity the regime will have is towards ASEAN membership. So ASEAN has certain leverage in this case. And if ASEAN can play its card well, it can talk to various stakeholders, it can really make some dent in the political developments. Now, the next proposition that I'll like to make is that the military regimes and the transformation towards democracy, the transition, follows certain trajectory. And it's very difficult to influence from outside, unless, of course, the developments take the place, shape of some kind of a revolution against the existing regime, or an economic collapse, or some other drastic development of the country that makes things difficult for the regime to pursue the goal. If you look at other transitions that have taken place from authoritarian regimes to military to democracy, you will see that they have been very gradual and taken certain steps through which such has been achieved. Any disturbance to that will upset the situation and make things even worse. In January 2013, I wrote an article in Hindu where I tried to suggest that Myanmar will follow certain trajectory in terms of its transition to democracy. If any outside interference or anything try to push through that situation, it will boomerang. And such judgments arose out of experience in dealing with military-civilian relations in many of the countries where military took power. The reason why I suggested that is that in many ways, barring minor differences between the Indonesian and the Burmese military, in fact, they have a lot of similarities in terms of the worldview, in terms of the outlook, in terms of the training, and various other orientations. One shouldn't forget that both Myanmar military and Indonesian military were actually the product of the Japanese occupation in their countries. Both the military imbibed the Japanese values, discipline, order, values of the Japanese military, order, discipline, national unity. They are the guardians of the state and things of that sort. And in fact, it is not just Indonesia or Myanmar that have been influenced deeply by the ideologies of Japanese military of that period. In fact, even other countries like Singapore. In fact, if you read Lee Kuan Yew's book, his first autobiography, you will see that even Singaporeans were tremendously influenced by the Japanese occupation, and their insistence on discipline, order, unity had been a product of actually the Japanese training of that period. So my next point would be that such developments that are taking place can only be managed not through drastic pressure on this regime or trying to, take, for the time being, it is limited sanctions by the Western countries. But I would suggest that it has to be done through backroom diplomacy. It has to be done through gentle nudging and not through any sort of, describing the regime as genocidal or things of that sort. It has to be done very gently and softly to deal with this regime. One difference between the Indonesian military and the Burmese military is that the Indonesian military was much more open to the external world because of their training in the West, because of the fact that at one point of time, the military regimes were actually sustained by the American support, American training, American economic investment, and various other things. They were open to the Western influence. The Burmese military regime is not. In fact, the Burmese military regime was sustained by the Chinese. And if any drastic measures are taken against the regime, I would feel, or I would almost feel certain that the regime will turn to the Chinese for succor and sustenance. Now, my next point is actually why the coup took place at all at this time. It was not unexpected. In fact, the talk was going on from the time November election. Every now and then there have been reports that there might be a coup. I think there was tremendous distrust between the civilian authority and the military authority. The military was unpopular, despite the fact that constitutionally enormous powers to change the entire system. The civilian authority, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, was quite popular. But at the same time, they didn't have the power to change the political system. External pressures, to my mind, led Aung San Suu Kyi think in terms of changing or at least improving his fallen image. And to my mind, her success in the elections was her undoing. That has alarmed the military that despite all the talk about, the ethnic parties not very happy with the situation, or for that matter, the elections were not held in certain areas. But Aung San Suu Kyi is reaching out to the ethnic parties for a national government and to create a kind of a federal structure had actually alarmed the military and made them believe that it could be even possible to attain the miracle on the part of Aung San Suu Kyi to have that 75% support in some kind of a constitutional amendment. And to my mind, that has actually led to this particular coup. The next point that I'll be making is that one has to also understand the political economy of the situation. For the time being, the economy of the country, even though power was under the control of Aung San Suu Kyi, economy was basically controlled by the military. Military had involvement in each and every aspect of the economic activities of the country. Until and unless that can be reduced, or at least reduced to a manageable proportion, it would be extremely difficult for any government to push back the military into the barracks. So whatever developments that take place in the coming days will have to take into account some of these factors that no kind of international pressure or any revolutionary kind of approach towards the regime will bring miracles in Myanmar. Burmese military stubborn. They are not linked globally. Globalization has not really changed the country, except the citizens. Citizens have tasted the last couple of years, the freedom, the internet, and economic sort of, some kind of freedom. All that had influenced them, but it had not influenced the military. So the military will behave in a more manner that resembled its earlier sort of activities and earlier actions. Now, the possibility that can take place that under international pressure, and particularly under the pressure of ASEAN, if they threaten that Myanmar will be thrown out of ASEAN, that might work something. But that also has to be compounded with some kind of incentives to the military, that their internal budget would be improved, economic development will take place, where their children and others could be absorbed, particularly once the economic sectors develop and can absorb the children of the military officers. Only then they will sort of leave the scene to the civilian authority. But then civilian authority will not find it very easy to establish democracy in the country. 50 years, all the civilian institutions have been emasculated. Even at the ground, at the village level, the bureaucracy used to be military bureaucracy. All the economists and others who were at one time, jewels of University of Rangoon or Mandalay, had all left the country. So the internal structure, the capacity is lacked by Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi has not been able to build the leadership within the country. Once she leaves the political scene, she is 75 plus. And what happens after she leaves? What is the structure within the party that can really accommodate the kind of transition that might take place? What is the kind of attitude of the NLD towards the ethnic parties? All these things will have to be worked out before any sort of mechanism for changes that take place. The last point that I'll make is on the question of Rohingya issue. Undoubtedly, the army's reaction to the Rohingya issue was disproportionate. But I would suggest that even the international community's condemnation and calling Aung San Suu Kyi a kind of a sort of a part of a genocidal group within the country, I think was also disproportionate. I think critics fail to understand the complexities of Myanmar's civil-military relations, and also the fact that factors like ethnicity, history, cultural identity are ingredients of legitimacy in the country, in Myanmar. These are difficult issues, and from outside it becomes extremely difficult to give any suggestions to any of the Myanmaris. And one thing one has to remember, that in Myanmar, statehood is based on ethnicity. What the Rohingyas were trying to do was to establish themselves as a separate ethnic group, which will entitle them automatically a kind of a separate state out of the existing arrangement. A bordering state with Bangladesh, Myanmar will never accept them as a separate ethnic group and give them a separate state. Kofi Annan's recommendations in August 2017 was based on that line, that Rohingyas should not really insist on their ethnicity, but they should claim themselves as a minority, Muslim minority, and demand citizenship rights. The very same evening, the ARSA attacked the police posts in Myanmar, derailing the entire Kofi Annan sort of recommendations and suggestions. And that gave also Min Lam a kind of a handle to deal the situation in his own way. And I don't think Aung San Suu Kyi could have done anything to change the situation. Whether she was also part of that thing or not, that's a different question altogether. But to my mind, having studied military-civilian relations for the last 50 years, I know no political leader will risk her future by taking a different kind of a stand. And that too, in a situation where the Rohingyas in 1948 wanted to join Pakistan, at that time East Pakistan. So history is very important. And we may think that this is a kind of a cleaning, ethnic cleansing. But from a Burmese point of view, things could be different. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the responsibility to bring them back and to rehabilitate them. That is the moral responsibility and also responsibility of the state. But it has to be handled differently, not by calling them genocidal or anything of the sort. That will only harden the attitude of the military. This is an extremely complex situation, and one has to really take a complex and very nuanced approach to the whole developments. I think I'll stop at this stage, and maybe I'll join you afterwards. And now I'll request Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, because he has some urgent work, to make his presentation, and then of course we'll follow others.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
He doesn't need an introduction.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghoshal. Thank you very much for the invitation by the Tillotoma Foundation. And I'm so happy to join this very special group of Myanmar experts in India. I think we all have listened to you with rapt attention. The major highlight of this event really is to get this very perceptive and insightful perspective that you've just presented. There are many things I think we all would agree. There could be some propositions on which there could be a discussion, but that is precisely the purpose of this roundtable, so to say. My intention is not to appraise Professor Ghoshal's assessment, but rather to offer an answer to the second part of the topic, which essentially talks about what next. I think the coup and its implications have already been explained so well. Therefore, we all know that what happened is in front of our eyes, and now
Professor Ghoshal and of course Tillotoma Foundation. I'm glad to be here. It's interesting times, and all of us, I think, watching it closely. I kind of largely agree with Professor Ghoshal, so I'm not going to repeat it. The way I see it, I think the core understanding, we understand that military is the single most powerful institution, which has ruled the country for decades. Military certainly holds the key in how the events will play out, and I transformation taking place in the months and years to come. So, and of course, I'll get back into it when we discuss the alternatives. But what I thought, and I know there'll be many others discussing both the international reactions and otherwise, but just for brevity of the moment, and we can have a second round, as Professor Ghoshal you mentioned. Let me just see that how does the situation unfold, and for us sitting in India, what does this mean? I'm going to be the devil's advocate here and suggest some alternatives. And maybe in the course of it, I'll probably raise more questions than I'll find answers. But I think let's look at the other options. I mean, we of course know what the Indian options are. And I also at the same time would like to say that I do believe all of us in students of international politics that there is no clear white or black option here to choose from. And I think in any such situation, India should be in a position where it can exercise different options available. I think that is the imperative of the time. And there clearly can be no one single way or, one single measure that can actually resolve the case, or, how India can be abreast it, or, be over the thing. So it's actually a complex issue at play, and we'll have to, try and do many things. And I'm sure many is being done. It's not that it's not, but at the same time, for today's discussion, I think I need to flag a few points. Of course, for foreign policy, I think perception plays a significant role. And again, while I'm focusing on India, and Professor Ghoshal has touched on ASEAN, and of course, and I'm sure, and during discussion we can talk about the other roles. But for us sitting here, I think how India and how it implies the implications for India is more important than anything else. But as I said, in foreign policy, perception plays a huge role, and Indian measures and policies have always been perceived as a being a soft neighbor. We've seen in the past vis-a-vis Myanmar, and now also, I mean, we have stated that we want to see democratic transition taking place, but certainly unwilling to push for it. I'm aware of the fact that there are many reasons and factors as to why that influence us. But India, as in the past and in the last 4 weeks or so, has been cautious, pragmatic. Nothing unusual about that, because stability as a borders are critical to our national interest. And we know that it will always be the military in the decades to come. I mean, I don't think that situation is going to change in the 10 years. Who will be able to support that stability that we want at the borders? And of course, the China factor, and we can discuss that again later. So the Indian statement, which says, I think the latest statement that I remember seeing, that we have been closely watching the situation in Myanmar. We have been discussing this issue with the partner countries, and we have said that the issue should be resolved through peaceful manner. I mean, there's nothing to question about that. I think it's something that everybody would agree to. There are clear factors, as I said, that if India is harsh in terms, in conveying to the military in the terms of a value-based foreign policy, it may lose access to the military and the leverage that it has over the military leaders. But again, I'm going to question as to what is the leverage that we really have. Secondly, also the economic and the business interest that India was growing in Myanmar. Then it's not substantial. It's a work in progress. It's been a long work in progress. If you recall, most of the major projects are still, because the instability that surrounds all these projects, they haven't been. Small gains we've done in terms of improving the capacity building and some other education and health sectors, but it's largely, it's not substantial. But again, more importantly, and this is something that perturbs us under the position which is we right now, that the geopolitical competition with China, if I can call it competition at all, I don't think it should be, but that's something that constantly influences. Even if you don't state it as back of the mind, I think that's something that is a core issue for us when we discuss Myanmar. We know that the two armies have been working closely, and at a certain level, India has earned the trust of the Tamada. It's not that there hasn't been any communication with them in the past, and I'm sure there are some channel which is open just now. So even the last visit, the foreign secretary visit, was also where the chief of army accompanied. This is a clear message of the close links that we have. But this is again something that we need to strengthen, and we've been working on that, whether at the bilateral level or even at the multilateral level. I mean, again, something that's it's again been a work of progress, but we certainly do have a close link with the armies on both sides. On the other hand, for generations, India has been home to many ethnic groups, has extended support to them over years. It's not only in the Northeast, but also we've seen in Delhi and elsewhere that we've had. And this, I'm not even talking about the Rohingyas, and a very negative announcements came yesterday from the Jammu area where there were, but that's a separate issue when we discussed Rohingya. But even if we assume that India's pragmatism will ensure that we remain on the right side of the Tamada, but at the same time, how do we see the escalation of violence and the sustained protest from the streets and international condemnation? Usually, I mean, we've seen how ASEAN, from its reticent ways in the initial weeks, have now been a far more, kind of directed the, I would say, censoring the movement. So, is it time for India to shift gears? I'm quite convinced that while military is a strong player there, the key player, as I did mention, but I don't believe that this particular position that they've just like, this whole coup and being in charge, it's not going to be sustained for long. And there has to be some changes on the ground. And we can discuss that. I don't think that, we know about the fact it's not only with the military, General Heng who wants to extend his, July extension and all of that. That's of course one part of the story. But again, the entire security force is, backing this particular move that's been made by him. So, but I'll come back to the moot point here for discussion is, can India make a difference or does it believe it can? Um, First and foremost, I think I would want to understand, and again, I'm asking more than I'm actually answering, whether our own security forces can ensure that our borders are stable without the active support of the across the border security forces from our neighbors. This is something imperative to us because for long we've seen how we had to be dependent on Bangladesh, on Nepal, on Myanmar for us to provide that cross-border security. Is it time to re-examine our policy on the border? I mean, is it possible that we need to be independent of the cross-border neighbors to ensure Indian security? We are not in the 1980s anymore. I mean, the kind of advancement that India's had seen on technology and the new innovations that are available to us now. Is it possible that we move from this constant thing that we are mired in this complexity simply because our cross-border security is ensured and we can't step out of that comfort zone? Is it time for us to now? I mean, we've been hearing about the Atmanirbharta policy for long. Is this something that we can actually apply and implement and develop? I'm saying, is this a time to start doing that? We'll never, I mean, decades we're going to keep discussing this probably. Oh, we wanted to do that, but our hands are tied. This is something that this is probably a moment when we need to see that how we can untie our hands. Secondly, I would think that while and I certainly believe that India has a channel of communication open with Atmagana. Is it able to convey the displeasure? Uh, you know, I mean, there's of course Ambassador Bhatia and other, former diplomats here who would say that, often what is in the public domain, a lot more happens at the private level, which is a fact. I'm sure many such channels are being, used at this point of time. But in a situation like this, I mean, where everything is unfolding in a way where the whole world is looking at this particular, development taking place at this corner of Asia, is it time for a public face to convey some hard facts? And I take Professor Ghoshal's point very, with a lot of, how shall I say, importance, where he says that yes, they can't be pushed, they can't be nudged, they can't be insulted. Uh, those, because it's just going to be make it more aggressive. It's not going to be there's no benefit out of that. I agree to that point that the nature, they are extremely inclusive. They are not likely to be opening up to this thing that somebody is being hard on them. But at the same time, for India at this point of time, that is, do we need to at some point, I mean, considering the fact that the early 1980s India is not the India today, in 2021 it's a different India, that we need to do a bit of hard talk. I mean, is it important to understand that while we have a linkage with Amada, can we leverage it? Or are we always going to be onlookers? And I mean, we'll always want to be, okay, guys, we have a great linkage, we are doing well with you. But I mean, our hands are tied, we are limited, there's nothing that we can do about it. There has to be some way, because even the Tamadas probably, I mean, it has, of course, support from China and others. There is no doubt on the fact. But India, in a certain way, is a strategic key player. While economically may not be so, but certainly in politically and strategically, India is a key player. And we need to also understand how Tamada looks at India. So while we've been saying the right words and doing the pragmatic policies ahead, at the same time, is it time for us to take a slightly nuanced, step from what we've done always? The other thing that I was wanting to examine, is it possible that India can also, uh, you know, like ASEAN has, and we've seen other Western powers have been doing, then also India have a discussion. And I think there has been some, I mean, of course, the statement says you're talking to the regional partners. Talking to regional partners is something, but wanting to influence, are you able to leverage that? India, of course, we know India and Myanmar is also on BIMSTEC. So is it time for India to kind of lead the way and here, saying that, we really not happy with what is happening. We understand some of the conditions on the ground and why it occurred, but at the same time, let's look at the large question. Is it something that we are able to convey to India? If not, and I don't see how then that really helps it. It's always back to business kind of a thing. We keep quiet, they go ahead, and it moves forward. Also, the other power that we work very closely with is Japan. Japan also has been pretty clear as to how unhappy with developments. It initially rolled back. A lot of all that happened. So I'm just saying that while, of course, India prefers, has always wanted to work bilateral, at a certain situation, there is when you need partners, you need your other collaborators to be with you on the same page, just to, convey that. India tag itself to any of that? Or will it just annoy the armed forces and it's not going to have any tangible benefit? I'm just asking. I'm not sure. I mean, I understand for sure that India has limitations. And I also, when I'm constantly using the word limitations, I'm finding it strange that I say this. If you look at some of our loud political declarations these days about how India is their leader power in Asia, somehow it contradicts. I mean, that's where my problem here is on this particular thing, that pragmatism, border stability, our whole, security paradigm, all that I understand. But when you are wanting to, aspiring to be a leading power, not even South Asia and Asia, you need to also find other mechanisms and measures to make yourself count. I'm saying India needs to be counted here. So while, of course, and I'm going to say that there is a lot of exercises being happening behind the scene, I have no doubt about that. But India needs to have a multi-pronged approach. And India, I think, at certain level needs to assert that the usurpation of power, as we saw what has happened just now, certainly contradicts the international norms and standards that India has often talked about. I mean, with China, we constantly say this. So why is it that we are not able to say this just because they are partners with us in our addressing thing? Um, Thirdly, and this is just again a question that I'm asking, that suppose, I mean, our little shift in gear, as I said, were to dilute this proximity with the Tamada and say that it's unacceptable and India has to face the consequences. What is the consequence? I mean, of course, border stability, of course, ranks as a priority. But again, as I said, I mean, our economic business interest is a work in progress. It's not as if it's going to, crash land it. Uh, and also, again, and I think that's another skepticism, that's another reason why we are so reticent about is that India is apprehensive about opening the Pandora's box. I mean, India does not want others to tell us how to run our country, right? So at that level, also, I think India would want to kind of hold back, saying that, okay, we are watching, we are concerned, but that's it. I mean, we'll try whatever backdoor diplomacy is possible, whatever quiet measures are possible. But I'm saying in 2021, the way India wants to be a leader, it's probably, trying to kind of take a different, a little nuanced position. Uh, can India have a better standing in the global community? And I'm saying we need to weigh the options. It's not that there's no clear black and white. And a lot of what I feel here is that while India today is certainly fettered and fussed about as a global player, and there are many powers in the community who wants to have India on its side. But have you ever thought? I mean, of course, we are an economic giant and all of that, but a large section of the fact that they want India on its side is also to counter China because they feel in Asia, India is only one. And of course, right now we have two, three other players who are emerging, also big players in South Asia. That India is more seen as a counterweight. It's India is not being feted in first as a sole powerhouse. I mean, that is one particular factor, but that's certainly not the overriding factor. So, what is it that India is so apprehensive about? I mean, I think the one thing that we are, I mean, while we may be saying it and conveying in different ways, I mean, this huge last section of people, and again, we've heard from Ambassador Ghoshal and we probably from here. There's a huge, situation which is changing there in terms of the section of people who are rallying. We've seen the image of the nun yesterday who said, "Attack me first." So, are we as a nation who has a certain values and a norms that we've established, we wish to uphold? Are we going to make the people's interest subservient to the interest of the armed force just because on grounds of pragmatism? I mean, I'm not forgetting the pragmatic issue, but I mean, is that all that works for India? I mean, while if you recall, many of us, you would remember 1990, a similar a situation happened in Bangladesh, where all the political forces, including the bureaucracy in every sector that you can think of, got together, and the military leader Ershad had no choice but to step down. The landscape in Myanmar is far too complex for us to even imagine such a development. But it's the coup has brought together a whole lot of ethnic groups in a way that we haven't seen in decades. And I think that's a very, very positive development. And I think from the kind of a quagmire that Myanmar had for years, where, I would say, where the military and even at a certain level, NLD was forcing one against the other, that I think this particular coup will actually change, where the groups will rally around each other. Of course, Rohingya is a very severe issue. And my fear about the Rohingya issue is that other powers, extra regional powers, are going to use the Rohingyas, many of them who are in our land, many in Bangladesh and elsewhere, to hit back at us. And this is the time that we need to stand up for. I'm not sure what happened in Jammu yesterday and what was the timing was, I think, all wrong. But I think we need to look at the Rohingya issue and how that impacts. So it's something that we need to really watch more closely in terms of that we can't afford to be a hands-off kind of a thing. And by saying that, yeah, we are talking to everybody and we are hoping and we are building some houses for them there. But if the conditions on the ground are not possible, you cannot, I mean, just send them. So, right now, I don't think. I mean, as I said, I think at the coup at a certain level has bridged the gap of apathy between ethnic minorities and Bama majority, from which some other has, for long drawn its legitimacy. That is going to change here. But at the same time, if India chooses to go with pragmatism, which of course has to, and it is understood and it is certainly empathized by everybody, not only us sitting here, but every other part to be. I think there is a point about how India will never be the moral compass in the region or outside. So that's the choice that we have right now. I'm going to close here for these initial remarks and I'll come back to you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I'll request Udai Bhanu.
Okay. Thank you, Tillotoma Foundation, for giving me this opportunity to be with everyone here with very useful inputs on the Myanmar coup. And the recent coup in Myanmar, of course, is a policy challenge for the entire world, especially the neighborhood. And how does India respond to it? That will be an important thing for us to watch out for. After this coup that took place on the 1st of February, it's interesting that it also took place at a very difficult time of the COVID pandemic. And this 1 year of state of emergency, which has been declared, and the body, the newly formed body, the State Administrative Council, headed by Senior General Hilang, all this is going to influence developments, and primarily, of course, the civil disobedience movement, which has started, and the killings that have taken place. All that has added fuel to fire, and we have to now look at the future. This was the third coup in Myanmar's history. The other two were, of course, in 1962, General Navin, and then again in 1988. This was also the second time when the election results were annulled by the military. The last one, of course, was in 1990. Actually, the military already had a fair share of power in the government recently. And the 2008 constitution, as we know very well, that it had secured a special place for the military with 25% of seats in parliament and local legislatures reserved for the military, and the three key ministries of Home, Defense, and Border Affairs being reserved for them. Now, there was perhaps a fear of that NLD may be heading towards amendment to the constitution, though that would have been difficult. And of course, Aung San Suu Kyi herself was denied a possibility of becoming president by the constitution itself, which said that no one with a foreign spouse could aspire for presidency. Thus, the compromise that NLD was trying for was that compromise has now come to a dead end. What would be the regional implications of this? Some of the ASEAN states like Singapore may have a strongly worded statement against the military regime, while others like Thailand may be more softly worded. Malaysia, Indonesia have called for ASEAN to hold special session dealing with the Myanmar coup. And ASEAN will follow a policy of non-interference, as we know. Ultimately, Myanmar's coup is likely to have multiple regional responses at a time when many ASEAN states themselves are witnessing democratic backsliding. Now, what has been our response to the coup? India's initial response, as the largest democracy, expressed deep concern at the developments and said in a press statement that we believe that the rule of law and democratic process must be upheld. And we are monitoring the situation closely. Later, the Embassy of India website stated that it is deeply saddened by the loss of lives in Yangon and other cities of Myanmar. And we express our heartfelt condolences to families and loved ones of those deceased. We would urge all to exercise restraint and resolve issues through dialogue in a peaceful manner. Now, India has been requested by the Myanmar military to hand over the police officials who have sought refuge by crossing over the Indo-Myanmar border. New Delhi has, of course, responded by saying that they are examining the issue. The government of India has reportedly started the process of deportation of more than 150 Rohingya refugees back to Myanmar who are living illegally in Jammu and Kashmir. India has rejected the UN position that it violates the international legal principle of refoulement, or sending refugees back to a place where they face danger. But then India is also not signatory to the relevant UN convention or protocol relating to status of refugees. India has stepped up border patrols, mainly to check any influx of refugees. India seeks to harmonize its relationship at the bilateral, regional, global levels. And that is done through three of its policies: Neighbourhood First policy, the Act East policy, and its Indo-Pacific policy. So these three policies working together, we hope to be able to deal with the problem in our neighborhood. India's Neighbourhood First policy dovetails into India's Act East policy. When we talk of Neighbourhood First, geostrategic importance of Myanmar comes up, and that is well known for me to be repeating here. It is the only ASEAN country with which we have a land border. 4 of our northeastern states border Myanmar: Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur, and Mizoram, covering over 1,600 kilometers. And it remains important primarily because of our need to deal with the insurgency in India's northeast, the China factor, and finally the importance for maritime reasons, importance of Bay of Bengal. Now, border management and insurgency in northeast is the primary focus. India's problems could increase as the military focus will be on urban areas due to the protests taking place in Myanmar. Hence, thinner presence could be on the periphery on our borders with Myanmar, where earlier clashes between army and the Arakan army have taken place in Myanmar. Now, the Rohingya problem, which has been referred to by earlier speakers, over 700,000 had fled since 2017 to Bangladesh. And it is, of course, feared that some of them could be radicalized by Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. The Arakan Army, or AA, was designated by Aung San Suu Kyi's government as a terrorist organization in March 2020 in Rakhine State. Myanmar's Election Commission had cancelled voting across much of the Rakhine State also. Now, the COVID-19 has reignited the power struggle among the main stakeholders that are there in Myanmar. The military, the political parties, the ethnic groups. This power play is at times has been in the past very subtle or sometimes plainly overt. Now, Myanmar government has to solve a number of problems before the next elections, which the military has promised. Two major infrastructure projects which India has undertaken, the Kaladan multimodal project, the trilateral highway project, when completed would be of significance as the trilateral highway will connect More to Mae Sot in Thailand. Other development projects are also ongoing, Reach-Idem and so on. Now, the China factor is important to us. And when the Chinese president visited Myanmar in January last year, important agreements were signed with Aung San Suu Kyi. Earlier, Myanmar, China had signed an MOU to establish the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor in 2018. And with this 1700-kilometer corridor meant to connect Kunming to Myanmar economic hubs, first to Mandalay and then east on to Yangon and west to Chok Fu. So Chok Fu would be an important focus. This would provide Indian Ocean access to landlocked Yunnan province in China. Another important agreement signed in 2018 was related to the new Yangon City project. In the midst of COVID-19, China was busy pushing for the BRI project or the China-Myanmar economic projects such as Chok Fu Special Economic Zone, the China-Myanmar Border Economic Cooperation Zone, or the Ruili-Muse Cross-Border Economic Cooperation Zone project, and the new Yangon City project. Myanmar has also witnessed a rise of panic vigilantism. Now, if the West imposes sanctions, Myanmar will once again slide into China's sphere of influence as it did in a period earlier. Now, as far as India's Act East policy is concerned, it is our linchpin. Myanmar is the linchpin. And Prime Minister Modi had announced it in Naypyidaw itself in 2014. If you look at our Indo-Pacific policy, it means we coordinate our policy with the major powers, as some of the speakers have already alluded to, with the major powers and also with the other middle powers. That is why the latest summit meeting of Prime Minister Modi with his Japanese counterpart, that is becomes important, where the Myanmar situation was discussed, as you know. As a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council this year, India can play an important role with other partners, especially countries like Vietnam, who in building international opinion on Myanmar. Vietnam, as you know, is also a UN Security Council non-permanent member this year. If a supportive international environment is built up through the United Nations and ASEAN, the military in Myanmar could be encouraged to follow the democratic roadmap. This would also be in keeping with the larger goal of preventing Myanmar for falling into China's lap again. Now, if you were to ask me about the scenarios that could be possible in Myanmar, Scenario 1, I would say, is that democracy returns to Myanmar and that Tatmadaw decides to retreat. Second scenario could be that there is a stalemate. The military brings in new constitution and decides to hold elections with a more stringent constitution. Scenario 3, of course, could be that the military rule continues beyond 1 year with more repression. Finally, in conclusion, I would say, it is true Aung San Suu Kyi's popularity has gone up domestically, especially since her arrest. But it is also true that Aung San Suu Kyi has lost some of the moral high ground internationally against the Rohingyas at the ICJ in 2019. Foreign investment in Myanmar could slow down in times to come. If the crisis extends beyond 1 year, Myanmar could go into an isolationist mode of Navin era, and the double whammy of COVID pandemic and backlash against the coup will precipitate an economic recession. According to the EIU, primarily because of investment going down. If protests lead to massacres and entrenched rule of the military, strong sanctions will cripple the economy totally in Myanmar. This would lead to greater dependence on Myanmar on China and greater involvement in the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Myanmar economic projects. Sanctions have failed in the past. India must not join the sanctions bandwagon against Myanmar, as has been suggested by some of our own. Domestically, India has done well to support Myanmar during the health crisis by sending a lot of vaccines on a priority basis to Myanmar. In the worst case scenario, could history repeat itself in Myanmar, as in 1958 when Parliament willingly handed over power to the military, or in 1962, the military snatched it from Parliament? It is more likely that history will not repeat itself, but what could happen is the military party, USDP, could re-emerge as a force again and prolong the process of democratization in Myanmar. The strain on the inter-ethnic relations could lead to the alienation of the ethnic minorities and possible backlash. The biggest problem in Myanmar is ethnic disarray. All in all, the situation in Myanmar is a worrisome one, and the best option for India's policymakers would be to keep up the engagement with all stakeholders in this strategically important neighboring country. It should try to shape the course of events in Myanmar to a peaceful resolution in concert with its ASEAN partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Udai Bhanu. I'll ask Subir Bhaumik to make his presentation.
Okay, I am pretty happy with the points made by Sreeradha Datta. I'm absolutely on the same page for three important reasons. Is that if India believes it's an important power in the region, no superpower, but a swing state maybe, but an important power in the region, we better start behaving as one. Inaction is not a substitute for somebody who considers itself to be an important power. So I would actually take off from where Udai Bhanu left, saying that we need to engage all the important stakeholders here. Now, I will elaborate on a couple of points that Sreeradha touched on, but she was, by her own admission, seeking answers to questions, and I have answers to some of them. We need the Tatmadaw less for our cross-border insurgencies today than they need us to handle the Arakan army. They are desperate that Indian army continues its Operation Sunrise, and I know this for a fact because I'm privy to some of these, military-to-military exchanges, at the border level where the commanders meet. Yeah. So as far as the insurgencies in Northeast, look at the Home Ministry's latest figures. 80% drop in violence, insurgent violence, and that kind of thing. Most of, except the strength of the NSC and IM, which is on the table and is likely to be on the table unless something drastically goes wrong, they are the only group with something like 6,000 to 7,000 fighters. And when I talk of insurgencies, it's not just academic discourse. I'm somebody who walks 200 kilometers and goes to rebel bases, and I know all these guys very well. So I can tell you one thing for sure, that except the NSC and IM, there is now at the moment, neither in Manipur, nor in Assam, nor in Nagaland, let alone the other states, any significant insurgent group capable of giving any kind of major problems for the Indian security forces. Yes, it's true that after the Operation All Clear in Bhutan, 2004, and the crackdown on the northeastern rebel bases by the Hasina government after she came to power in 2009, the Sagaing region of Myanmar is the only remaining trans-border base for the northeastern rebels, where they can train, they can regroup, they can bring in weapons too, and that kind of stuff. But look at the conditions there, and I know for a fact that there is rising desertions in the Alpha. The UNLF, which is the biggest group in Manipur, is split. They are attacking each other rather than Indian forces. The NSCN is on the table, not just the IM, but all the other factions in the format of the Naga National Political Workers Group. So why are we so worried about? We are not in 1980s when we would expect the Burmese army, the Tatmadaw, to do something about our rebels. And in any case, they don't do very much. They now did a bit. And please don't overestimate what they did. It was more for optics, handing over 22 rebels. I exactly know the standing of each of these rebel leaders who were handed over, brought back by a plane from Myanmar. Sometimes our diplomats love these optics, because it shows that, something is happening. But I exactly know who these guys are and what they stand. Why was this done? Previously, whenever we pressed the Burmese, the Tatmadaw, to do something in the Sagaing area, they would say, A, they don't have the resources, because much of their resources are actually focused against much stronger insurgencies, legitimately so, because they are their problems. These Indian insurgents are not really a Burmese problem, and they are in a particular area of Myanmar, which is pretty isolated even now, the Sagaing region. The Naga Autonomous Area, the Tenutapak ranges and the Taga region. And I've been there, not once, but twice. So I exactly know what I'm talking about. As that, only if the NSC and IM were to break off from the talks and return to the jungles, maybe we have a bit of a problem. But otherwise, Northeast is pretty much under control. And you can see the impact in the development projects taking place in the last 2 years. The speed that has picked up on the Jiribam, the Silchar Jiribam Railroad, and all these projects, and I can go on and on, to highlight this. But the point I'm trying to make here is, the Burmese today need the Indian army more because they really don't know how to handle the Arakan army. These are new generation rebels. They are, giving the Tatmadaw quite a handful. And if the Indian army does not continue its ongoing Operation Sunrise, the Burmese Tatmadaw will have greater cause for worry than we will have if they are not really cooperating in the Sagaing area. In any case, after 2019, November, the Tatmadaw has not mounted any major operations in the Sagaing region. They have not gone after Paresh Barua or the UNLF PLA leaders who are camping in the Ruili Tengchong region. And I know for a fact where these guys are located. We have details. So, the Burmese have not really done, given us the moon or the sun. We really do not have much of a reason, to, go overestimate this, Burmese health factor when it comes to cross-border insurgency. That's number one. Number two, do you realize something as a democratic nation, as the country of the Buddha, to whom the Burmese look up to, an average Burmese, for them, a pilgrimage to Bodh Gaya is like a Muslim going for Hajj to Mecca? We have enormous credibility, we have enormous heft in the psychological sense of the term, if not in the economic sense of the term, which we are squandering away because we are too defensive. We don't want to upset the Tama Darwin. Why? What have they done for us? What have they really done for us? In real terms, economic or otherwise. That's number one. Secondly, I can tell you one thing for sure, because I'm in direct touch with the movement every day on a daily basis. And I know for a fact that in the next 2 or 3 days, there is going to be a large-scale boycott of Chinese goods in Myanmar. Are our business people prepared to take the advantage? At least 17 Burmese businessmen have applied, and they are trying to lobby to get dealership of major Indian products, which could actually replace the Chinese products, because they have information. The Burmese businessmen know, and they're trying to do this. And some of them have come to me requesting, say I'm in teacher, because that's what I was in Mizima. I worked in Myanmar for a number of years and operated at the grassroots level, okay? Not attending seminars with, a suit and tie, right? So this is going to happen. Are we prepared to take the advantage? Why should we squander the huge heft and goodwill at the psychological level with the Burmese people and the political party? Now, I am not suggesting that we join the sanctions bandwagon, because the sanctions, Udai Bhanu is right, it affects the common people. Doesn't affect these military generals who are filthy rich and who have stashed away properties all over the world. Yeah, some of which might be affected if the Western sanctions happen. Because you know one thing, let me tell you, they turned to China for weapons and other forms of support when both were international pariah in the 1989-90 phase. But the Burmese generals don't save their money in Chinese banks, sir. Please take it from me. They'll sell, they save it in Southeast Asia and the West, yeah? Not even Indian banks, but that's not the problem. The problem here is that we are in 2021, and Sreeradha is absolutely right. It's an aspirational India. And all this Atmanirbhar and assertive India is all cliche unless you start behaving in a non-defensive way. This non-defensive, thing is very crucial, because generally this entire defensive attitude that we should be careful, we should not go too fast, we should not do this, we should not do that, is basically an apology for inaction, which is what we do most of the time. So coming back to the core issue, 3 things. A, we need to engage all the stakeholders. You know why? The Chinese have openly announced now that they are going to engage all the stakeholders in an attempt, quote unquote, to resolve the problem in Myanmar. And apparently the Biden administration has requested the Chinese, because they have connections to the military and of course to every other player in Myanmar. They may not like the Chinese, but they deal with them because China is important. So China is already entering there, and we are always reacting to China. But the point is, here, what is our position? We gave one statement on day one when the coup happened, and that was the right thing to do. But after that, why are we going into a limbo? Why are we, silent when all these massacre, killings are happening? I mean, I'm not saying genocide, and I know for a fact it's not a genocide, but these are massacres. 54 people killed, nearly 60 actually. So, and 200 injured, and the Burmese are now, the Tamadaw is beginning to open fire with live rounds. Let's also understand this. One of the speakers before me actually raised it, that with their involvement in controlling the civil disobedience movement, there's going to be less and less Burmese involvement in tackling insurgencies, especially the insurgencies they don't think is important. So Northeast insurgents, forget about the Tamadaw doing anything in Sagaing, at least in the next few years. The second point I want to make here is that this coup is a defensive move. This coup is to ensure that the miracle of a possible change of constitution that Dr. Ghoshal referred to does not happen. That, General Ming Aung Hlaing, who wanted to be president, can actually leverage a change situation to go to reach there. Because in the army, and that's true about all armies, including the Burmese, the next chief is no good. And he had to go in July. And he could not hang on like General Musharraf, because then the other generals get upset. Yeah? General Soto, General Meaptun U, these people are also ambitious people and they want to be chief. Okay? So here, I will suggest, I really think for the Burmese military, the game plan for them is this. They have taken over, but they're not saying it's a coup. It's a military takeover anyway. Call it what you may. But their main target is to cripple the NLD party organization. 2 of their leaders have died in jail. Many of them have been arrested, including Aung San Suu Kyi is under house arrest. The target is that to cripple the NLD party organization so badly that next time, under international pressure, when the Termadao is forced to, go for a fresh election, and they will not recognize this parliament. They won't recognize Aung San Suu Kyi's present position, 396 seats, with 44 seats of the ethnic parties and the Grand Coalition. They won't accept this. But they will have to go for a fresh election, and their target is damage limitation, so that next time the elections are held, Aung San Suu Kyi will still win the elections, but she should not get the kind of landslide that she has got this time. They are a military organization. And I went to a military school, so I know how people think in the military, which is, if you can't win the war, you limit, you play a defensive game, you limit the extent to which the enemy can cause damage to you. And that's exactly the mode in which the Termadao presently is. They can't do a 1988. And China, after all the bad name that it has got post-COVID, because of its handling of the COVID-19 crisis, the loss of credibility, look at, nobody's willing to take Chinese vaccines. Even Cambodia, after getting Chinese vaccines free, want Indian vaccines. And I've written about this. The point I'm trying to make here is that the Chinese are not in a position to shamelessly back a military junta if it goes for a 1988 type of a massacre. Because at that time, there was a massacre in Myanmar in 1988, and there was the Tiananmen Square thing, 1989, and the 2 international pariahs made blood brothers. Not the scene now. China is at the high table. They want to be seen as a responsible power. So there's no way. The reason the Chinese are saying, we want to engage all stakeholders, we're not happy with what has happened in Myanmar, because if you look at the streets in Myanmar, you'll see placards. Myanmar coup made in China. The popular perception among the Burmese bombers, not just ethnic people, is that the generals have done this because they have the backing of China. So China is extremely unpopular at all levels, except maybe the Termadao. Even the Termadao does not believe them because the Chinese back the Northern Alliance insurgent groups. The Chinese give man-packs and anti-aircraft guns to the WAS. You mean to say the Burmese military likes it? No. But then, as Udai Bhanu rightly says, if the international situation creates tremendous pressure, they will have to turn towards China. As General Maung Ai once told me when he was the chief of the Burmese military in a BBC interview, he said, when we look for weapons, we go to China. When we look for salvation of our soul, we look to India. Both guys. Yeah? Even the generals want a trip to both guys. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we have a few options and we should exercise them. And Sreeradha is absolutely right. She represents the kind of thought that I subscribe to, is that I'm not somebody who's suggesting that we rush headlong, we join the Western, sanctions bandwagon because sanctions only hit the people. But we should, in our own way, not allow the Chinese to emerge as the big thing in Myanmar, trying to bring everybody together on the table. We should be there because we have access to Termadao. Our military has reasonable access to Termadao today. I know it for a fact. And of course, we have access to the Burmese, political parties, especially the NLD, because they look up to India as a role model, not the Western democracies, by the way. So we should not squander this opportunity. I had made this suggestion when Aung San Suu Kyi was trying to bring about Panglong 2, this comprehensive peace process, a dialogue between the central government and the various ethnic rebel armies. And I had suggested we should send Pu Zoramthanga, the chief minister of Mizoram, because he knows many of them, if not all of them, very well. And he is today an Indian chief minister. What better example than this? That here is a country where you can fight the central government for 20 years, then return to the mainstream and, whatever it means, and be a chief minister. Sum this up by saying three things, sir, which is A, we have no reasons to be overtly defensive because the Burmese term it out needs us more for tackling the Arakan army than we need them today to handle the northeastern insurgent. Number one. Number two, we should not allow China to run away with the whole cake by becoming the arbitrator between the different stakeholders. We should play a role there as a responsible power, as a democratic country who has heft with the democratic parties, but also a reasonable relationship with Tamadaw. And possibly we join, we have some kind of a dialogue with ASEAN and try to get in there. But we should have a presence. And our businesses should take this opportunity. So our business has an opportunity to get in there big time, believe me. And we should not squander this opportunity. And the last point I'll make here is, that we, of course, we have, relationship with the various different stakeholders. But we should also remember that the Committee of Democratic Nations that is being put together, Quad or anything else, should not be just anti-China. We should, there is a place for value-based politics. And if India thinks it's a democracy, it has to align itself with other democracies, maybe prevent them from doing any excess, reaction like sanctions. But we need to be with them, to play a meaningful role in Myanmar. And I am strongly advocating that this is the time, if India has to be counted as a significant power, if we cannot play a significant role in Myanmar or Bangladesh, are we going to play it somewhere in Latin America? No. Thank you.
Thank you, Subir. I think I request Ambassador Gauri Shankar. Before I request Ambassador Gauri Shankar to make a statement, I think I'll just make a small comment on both Sreeradha's presentation and Subir Bhaumik's presentation. I think I agree with Sreeradha on the question of the need for regional leadership on the part of India. And after all, democracy, India's sort of commitment towards democracy and all that. On that point, I have no sort of, clash of interests or for that matter, no conflict with that view. And in fact, I myself, in my past writings, I was always suggesting that India should really play an important role in the promotion of democracy in Myanmar. But my problem comes from a practical point of view. How to go about? You see, the experience that we had in the 90s, which practically eliminated India from Myanmar or from Burma, old Burma, completely. And India had to restart, had to start everything all over again, in order to establish any semblance of influence in Myanmar or Burma, whatever you call it. Now, the second point also is that, how do you really go about? Situation is such at this moment that if we really join the Western bandwagon about, return to democracy and all that kind of thing, it's not going to work. They're not going to listen to it because Burmese military is a different altogether. They have their own sort of way of looking at things, and sometimes they don't mind even shooting in their own foot in order to retain their own sort of position within the establishment. So I think the real difficulty arises from the situation that how do you really go about? Now, it's also not true that India is not in sort of connection with the various or link with the various stakeholders. I think Indian diplomacy, the local embassy in Yangon or Naypyidaw, they have been, I think, retaining their sort of linkages with the various stakeholders within the country. So it is not, the difficulty arises out of really how do you go about. Now the thing is that people's faith in, as Subir said, people's faith in Buddhism and all that, they want to come to Bodh Gaya. That's a different question altogether. You see, I mean, how do you really approach the whole situation? That's my own problem. And the second issue, I think, is that whatever has to be done, it has to be done very subtly behind public glare, subtle diplomacy. But the point that Subir also mentioned and others also mentioned, that we have to really connect with the ASEAN. Because if at all anybody can make any influence on Myanmar, it is ASEAN as a grouping. And ASEAN itself has certain, constraints and compulsions in order to take any effective role in the region. Because ASEAN centrality is under huge threat, and they have to establish its relevance. ASEAN so far has not been able to make any impact on any of the developments in the region, East Timor issue, economic crisis, the AIDS crisis, and all that. I think now a time has come when ASEAN will have to work out some kind of an arrangement through which they will be approaching the military regime. And one more point that I want to say is that, everybody has been talking about third coup. It is actually a fourth coup. 58, when allegedly the civilian authority transferred it to the military to take care of the law and order. It was not actually a request from the request from UNU. You read UNU's autobiography, you will find that he was almost made to sign that arrangement under a gun. So it was only after, because the problem at that time was that UNU had actually promised some kind of a concessions to the various ethnic groups, some kind of a federal structure that he had promised at that point of time. Now the military vehemently opposed that. And that's why they forced UNU to hand over power to the military. And when they actually handed back power, they handed back power in such a situation where there was no other option but to keep the military as an important power broker within the political system. I think one has to know the past history of Myanmar in order to really come to any kind of judgment on this issue. Now, when the present military regime talks about an election, they might even sort of, this 1 year, they will look for an election, but they'll see to it that NLD does not come into power. They will try to promote their own political party that they're trying to promote, USDP. So the question is a very complicated situation at this moment, and each country, this is not question of sort of bravery at this moment. One has to observe the situation in a very subtle manner. The thing is that, one point that I'll make, again from my own experience, people may be thinking about the people's power. Suharto did not quit from politics because of people's power. Suharto quitted from politics essentially because of IMF conditions. IMF imposed the condition in the economic crisis that you have to remove the subsidies from oil as well as the cooking oil. And the cooking oil was very important to the ordinary Indonesians. There would have been a popular revolution within the country if Suharto would not have stepped down at that point of time. The situation in Myanmar is not that. There cannot be a people's revolution at this moment in Myanmar there could be protest and demonstration. So I think one has to handle the situation in a much more sort of pragmatic manner, living out your own ideological preferences at this moment. Anyway, I'm open to sort of comments on this afterwards. But before that, Ambassador Gauri Shankar.
Thank you very much, Professor Ghoshal. You have summarized some of the points very well. I must confess that I'm not an expert on Myanmar, but being part of the Indian Foreign Service, I do a little bit about the country and the problems and our relationship. So taking that perspective into account, I would like to make a few points. Firstly, it is very clear that military has been playing an important role in the politics of Myanmar. This is not something recent. It has been historically there. There have been multiple coups. Even if not coups, the civilian governments had direct and indirect interferences from the military. Second, the constitution of the Myanmar, the latest one, provides for clear role for the military in the country's governance. So military's role is there whether we accept it or not. Second point is that Myanmar military is also interfering in the economy of the country. Like in Pakistan, they control a lot of economic levers, and therefore they are able to influence the economic decisions which impact the masses of the country. So we should not ignore that point either. Now, from India's perspective, there are many things. Firstly, we share a long border with Myanmar. It's more than 1600 kilometers, covering many northeastern states which are very important for our security point of view. Secondly, we have historic ties. It's not only that at one stage Myanmar was part of Greater India, but we also have Buddhism as a very deeply connecting factor between our two countries. Then we have access to ASEAN. Myanmar is the first country with land borders with India through which we have access to ASEAN, and the roads which we are developing through Myanmar to Thailand and other parts of the world are actually very, very significant in that respect. So our interest is vital in that form as well. Then one point which has been made very clearly by many speakers is the Chinese influence. Of course, whether we accept it or not, excessive Chinese influence in Myanmar is not in our interest. And we cannot allow China to rule Myanmar through backdoor or through different systems in either economically or militarily or through the civilian government. That will not be in our interest. We have to provide a counterbalance to that process. Then we have separatist movements in the past in our own country where the Myanmar connection was very clear. It has now become weak, but things can revive. That's always possible. So we have to be careful. So there are many interests we have with Myanmar. We have a long border. We have historical ties. We have ASEAN connection and connectivity to ASEAN. We have Chinese factor. We have Buddhist factor. And of course, we have the factor which is through the separatist groups in the northeastern region. So all these factors have to be taken into account. Now, Rohingya issue is the latest one, which has been in the past long time back, but it has come back. There is another factor which is going to affect our relations with Bangladesh as well as with Myanmar. So all these factors taken into account, and based on my study of international relations, one thing which is very clear in my mind that we should not become part of the Western alliance in sanctions. Sanctions are not going to work. They have not worked in most of the countries where they were being imposed. In fact, they create enmity and general masses suffer in the process. So that option should be ruled out completely. Now we should also look at, somebody talked about value-based foreign policy. I personally believe in basic values of foreign policy. One of the basic values of foreign policy, our foreign policy has been that we will not directly interfere in somebody else's internal affairs. Now that has been a stand. We don't want anybody else interfering in our internal affairs. Similarly, we should not interfere. But then this is a thin line. This is a very thin line because of what we call, if situation becomes violent, if masses are repressed, then the line has to be observed and seen what should be done. So that question has to be seen in and has to be studied properly. But coming first to the question of interference in other countries' affairs, we have seen that American interference in Cuba has failed over decades. In Venezuela, it has failed over decades. In Iran, it has not succeeded. And then countries like America and the Western allies, they accept different forms of governance in different countries depending on their national interest. We can take the example of Saudi Arabia, or we can take the example of many Arab nations. We have many dictators which have been promoted by Western alliances. So we have to act in accordance to our national interest rather than following a policy that we will promote democracy. I don't believe in promotion of democracy. Every country has a right to set up their own system of governance. But that system should be fair to the nation. That system should not mean repression of masses. That is where we have to put our attention. Now, so far the situation has not been so bad, but it is turning bad with a lot of people being killed on the streets. Now, if that situation continues like this, then India will have to tell politely but not publicly, in talking to the generals whom we know, that this kind of situation must be avoided, because the negotiations in public do not yield proper results. In fact, the diplomacy should work quietly and should work through known and informal channels. And we have contacts with the Myanmar military. There's absolutely no problem in reaching them out and telling them that please do not indulge into large scale violence. That is one thing we should do to begin with. Secondly, slowly, once the situation stabilizes, we should tell the same people that there should be some sort of democratization of the situation. How you evolve, it should be your decision, but a popular government should be in place over time. And that is what we have to promote. That promotion is possible not through public stances, but through internal channels. And I think that is what we have done in some countries which have worked very, peacefully but very successfully. Similar position in this case we should adopt, both with the political parties and the government and the military. We should bring them together. If necessary, India can even offer a sort of, promoting a dialogue between the political parties and the military and the civil society in that country without directly coming into the picture. I think that is the way I look at the situation, because ultimately the situation will have to be solved by the people of that country. So long as the violence is not promoted and it remains within very narrow ambit, I think we should work through the back door. We should work quietly, and we should tell these people that it is not in your interest to indulge in this kind of thing. Now, this is also the time when we can make use of the situation to strengthen our economic links with the country. Uh, One of the previous speakers mentioned that uh, they are looking forward to the Indian products in Myanmar. So why not, if we can, get into the Myanmarian market right now, to get into some of the economic systems in that country, that will not be a bad practice. So my solution to the problem is, let us watch and let us work quietly. Let us use our diplomatic channels. Let us use our military channels. Firstly, to reduce the violence, to contain the violence, to stabilize the situation, And secondly, in order to promote a dialogue between different stakeholders without our coming directly into the picture, but we remain in the background and we help them to work out a dialogue. Then third point which I want to mention is ASEAN. I think we have to prompt ASEAN to play a little more active role in Myanmar. That can be done without much problem. We have very close contacts in ASEAN countries, and ASEAN's role in Myanmar can be far more effective and far more conducive for us than it can be directly through us. So I think we do our role directly, but then we also use ASEAN indirectly to promote that kind of stability in the country. But let us not forget that military is not going to get out of power completely in that country. It will stay in some form. Some limited acceptability of military power in that country is a reality. It is the ground reality which we must accept, which has been on for the last several decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Okay, now, you mentioned Ambassador and also Subir. Both of them mentioned about India getting involved in the economy of the country, economy of Myanmar, through investments and through greater economic activities. I think, the main problem arises from the fact that obviously a parallel or a kind of a comparison has to be drawn with China. In the case of China, most of the businesses that come to most of the countries in Southeast Asia are actually state-owned businesses. So they get some kind of a guarantee from the state regarding their investments and other things. In the case of India, it is more private investments, not the public sector kind of investment. It is private investment. And somehow, Indians suffer from a kind of a complex. They are reminded of the past history. To be very fair to them, is that many of them have burned their fingers because so many times Indian businesses were nationalized. They were practically made into paupers, sent them back to India during the period of Navin, and also even in the past. So I think Indians suffer from this particular complex, and that's why they want some kind of a state of bank guarantee before they go into sort of full involvement in business. I think we have to make some kind of arrangements whereby they could be given certain amount of confidence in terms of their business interests in the country. Now, the second point, regarding the Chinese role in Myanmar. Now, this present junta has appointed an Israeli-Canadian lobbyist to actually lobby for the junta in the West. And the line of argument is that it is not the military which wants connections with China. It is not the military which had really taken actions against the Rohingyas. It is actually Aung San Suu Kyi who had ordered this, crackdown on the Rohingyas. And it is Aung San Suu Kyi which was coming closer to China. So that's why they're trying to prevent the situation. And that's why they sort of struck at the, past NLD government. So, it's a very peculiar kind of a situation in Myanmar. One doesn't know what is sort of going on and what is true and what is not. But anyway, I think on the basis of our earlier presentations, if any of the panelists have any comments.
But again, I completely, as I said, Professor Ghoshal, I accept your initial remarks about the fact that, we have to, I'm not saying that we don't have multilateral, multi-engagement going on. And I know that what we see on the surface is, nothing compared to what probably under the surface some things are, being done, and plenty is being done. I have no two ways about that, especially the military engagement, because also in the past, and I've heard it from our former diplomats also, that how they Tatmada had reached out, and all of that. So that is there, that exists. But I'm saying there's certain times and moment of history where you need to stand up. This is what I'm saying. I'm not discounting any of the other engagement, the different stakeholders. End of the day, every relationship is about people.
Right,
And
right.
while I completely agree, and I've said this myself, I've written about it myself, that the military is going to be in power in some ways or the other. I mean, the way I see it, I mean, I'm no soothsayer. As a student of politics, I don't do any determining the future, but I just try and read the present and contemporary, and then kind of assume, I mean, make some assumptions that the military will renegotiate. And I agree to the point, I think, I don't know who it was, Subir, who made that they will, the whole thing was NLD was getting too much for them. They were not able to handle. And also the point that NLD was actually working closely with China. That's not be, China has a very intrusive space there, but disliked across the board, including from the military forces. Unlike Thailand, who in fact has greater, lots of stake there, and we've seen how it has spoken. Also, Japan, if you see the kind of stakes that they are growing there, those are the ones that we need to examine. We need to see if we can partner them. I'm just saying this constantly. We don't interfere in anybody's business. Is a gospel for everybody. I mean, I'm not discounting that. That's not the point here. The point is if we stand up for democratic values, because end of the day, it's a people-based relationship. Government to government and all that is fine, but again, on the business front, last time in my when we went to Myanmar, we met the chambers of commerce there, and there are a lot of Indian companies, and I completely agree that while I mean it's easy to say that China is moving out or they're being hated, it's a good time for Indian businessmen. Indian businessmen, as you see, our entrepreneurs are not all that initiative based. They need to be prodded with the government, and I completely agree with you, Dr. Ghoshal, that this can't happen overnight. I mean, for years we've seen, or even on the cross border, I've spent many days on the More cross border to see what is going on there. So I've understood that. So, these are, I mean, again, it's very simple to sum up everything in few minutes on a seminar, but many of us who watch the area closely, but I'm just saying that, history is going to judge us differently if we don't, at this point of time, take a kind of a nuanced position. To say that, yes, we've given the MA policy is fine, but I'm saying there is space, and I think the fact that we are able to reach out to a larger stake there, which we have. I mean, I don't think whenever we meet anybody in Myanmar, whether there's a business community, the ethnic groups I've met a lot of these ethnic leaders. They always have this thing about that India can do this for us. So we should not miss out on that thing, that where India is in a position to lead, to provide, to enable that. Nothing can happen. There's no drastic transformation that will happen there. But we must move away from this. I'm not taking a position. I'm just saying this. That's all I'm saying. I just come here and there's a question from the, do you want me to take this question here, which has been directed to me, or shall we come back later?
No, you can answer that question if there's
okay. He's asking about the economic sanctions. How do we see the implication with the economic sanctions coming out? How do we see the implications of the cross-border trade? Okay, in terms of the cross-border trade, which it was not only drugs. I mean, he's talking about drugs, drugs, illicit weapons, and human trafficking. That is something which happens in the strike, and that had nothing to do with sanctions. It was all about generating funds for these ethnic groups, the insurgent rebels. The government had very limited stake, really. It was this, motley groups of ethnic people that who were actually using this particular to fund and, fuel their particular movement that went on. So sanctions and this is not terribly linked. But again, while every situation has, I think the silver lining here for me is I feel that the ethnic groups are going to come together, and the fact that the government, the Tamada, has always played one against the other, they will see through that. And I'm very well, and I've said this in a couple of VI things also, that we need to look at these young, the ethnic players now. We need to look at the new political players that are going to come up. I mean, NLD and all of that is fine, but the new ethnic political party in some regions have actually made a dent even in the numbers this time. And this is with absolutely zero help from anybody, nor NLD, nor the Tamada, nor anybody. So I'm saying it's a good time to look at the new leadership which is bound to emerge in the days to come. And the fact that I completely agree that this was a very critical move to actually dilute the NLD. So if you're diluting NLD, there will be a kind of a level playing field for other ethnic players to come in. We must not lose our influence with them, our relationship with them, which we've had. And it's been very one-sided. I mean, except for one odd thing of George Fernandez and others, it's been a very one-sided. They've constantly taken space with us. Individuals have reached out to them, but we've not never done a government-to-government kind of a thing. But it's time when we start recognizing that there are other players which will actually give us that kind of a depth which we need in that country. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, very fair statement. And I completely agree with you that we have to really keep in mind that we need to play an important role, not just as just a bystander, but we have to take a role, and also certain amount of values also need to be taken into account in sort of crafting that approach. My own belief is that in the coming Quad meeting, India and Japan, obviously the issue of Myanmar will come up in that discussion. Australia had taken a little sort of extreme position, withdrawing its sort of certain defense cooperation. But I have a feeling that India and Japan would definitely try to impress upon them to at least craft a strategy through which they could approach the various stakeholders. And I'm not that pessimist in that sense. I'm quite optimistic because now the situation is very sort of, in a very sort of, uncertain way. Something will shape up in course of time. And the second point that you made about the ethnic political parties, I think time has to be given to them also to sort out their own sort of problems. For example, this time certain merger took place, yet they could not do much. So all these things need time. Actually, democracy is something which cannot be implemented overnight. It needs nurturing, it needs quite a bit of time, space has to be given to that. You can't just hurriedly do things. And that is my grievances against the West, that they were trying to impose conditions. They were trying to suggest that you try to implement democracy as quickly as possible. It can't be done because you see the countries also where democracy has come all right, but the old military leaders still play a very significant role in the political process of the country because civilian leaders have not been able to sort out their own difficulties, and the training, the capacity building, all that has not been done. So I think it will require time, and I'm quite optimistic that India this time would at least craft a strategy through which it will be able to at least put its mark in the political developments. But one has to give time for that. Now, I think Udai,
Professor Ghoshal, I'll just reiterate that the policy of sanctions that the West has previously adopted towards Myanmar, that policy is not going to work. And certainly India should not support such an approach. And I think you're quite right. The two countries which can understand Myanmar better are India and Japan. Japan particularly because it has the experience of having dealt with Burma in the past. I think India and Japan and within ASEAN, if there can be a greater understanding of the situation, these countries can do it. And then I also feel that the reason why the military would eventually have to be brought on board is because eventually the border will have to be manned by the border security forces. And we need to have that kind of working relationship, military to military, to carry that out eventually. But I would still maintain that we are not going to see history repeat itself. I think, as someone said quite rightly, history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So even though our past experiences of the Operation Golden Bird, when at that time India had given the award to Aung San Suu Kyi, the Jawaharlal Nehru Award, and then the militant Tatmadaw had withdrawn support to that operation, the joint operation that was going on the border. But now things have changed. I think there is no, it is, the exact parallels cannot be drawn with the past. So perhaps what Sreeradha was also saying about the need to be in tune with a historic moment, that also has to be factored in. And I think we need to observe the situation and continue with the dialogue with all the stakeholders, as I mentioned. Thank you.
You know, the views that have emerged is that it is a difficult situation and India has to take certain position on that, but how to evolve that position, there may be different ways of looking at things. And by and large, what we have from this discussion is that it is a complicated situation in Myanmar, and one has to see the developments that take place in the coming weeks. At the moment, situation is not very good because there is violence perpetrated by the present junta, and people are coming out in the open, protesting, carrying out civil disobedience movement. So there are fears of a much worse situation. And I think most of the stakeholders in the peace and stability of Myanmar are quite concerned about it, particularly, as I mentioned, ASEAN and also India. So I think we'll have to work out a common strategy to deal with this present situation and also to carry out engagements with the different stakeholders so the situation does not lead to something that is even worse than now. With that, I think I'll thank all the panelists and other participants in this webinar. Thank you.